Welcome back to the Grand Solar Minimum channel. Today is Sunday, October 21st, 2018. It's going to be a brief show tonight. I looked around on the internet tonight. Not a lot of action. Maybe I'm missing something, but tonight we're going to kind of go over a couple of articles that I found that I thought were interesting about the topic of our channel. Let's take a look at some solar wind conditions right now at 371.9 kilometers per second with a density around 12.3. Take a look at our sun. We are blank today. That's 0 sunspots. 3 days in a row, and we are now at 169 days without sunspots in 2018. So we have totally blown 2017 out of the water. And it's very, very possible that we will double the amount of spotless days in 2018 than what we had in 17. And let's try to compare to where we were in the last minimum. And as you see here, 08 and 09 were definitely the two peak months of the, or years, I should say, of the minimums. But take a look at this. So 16 would represent probably on this chart 2005. And then 2016 we could compare with actually, they don't have the data go back, so I'll have to go back and look at that. But my point I'm trying to make is that we are well over 70 days, 2017, 104 days, and then you go to 2007, and we are at 169 compared to the 152 in the last minimum. So I'm saying we have more spotless days in this particular minimum, almost by 30 to 40% less spotless days. So this minimum already showing us less activity than we had in the last one in 08, 09. That's basically what I was trying to translate there. Take a look at our KP indices. Right now we are sitting at a 1 and a 24-hour max of 2. Now, I've been watching the KP indices all weekend, and we've seen readings for 24 hours straight of 0, jumping up to a 1 for about 6 hours, then back to a 0 for 12 hours. Today we had a little action at 2, and it has now since dropped. And I can tell you why. And it has everything to do with this coronal hole in the northern part of our star that finally made a little noise today with our magnetic field. Now, NOAA suggested that we were going to have a G1 geomagnetic storm on around the 19th of October, 18th as well. Neither dates did we have any kind of solar activity. And then they kind of just stopped mentioning it. Actually, if we go to SPACEWEATHER.com, they kind of move on to the next event that we are expecting. Well, they took that down as well. So we were looking at the possibility of some maybe coronal hole and solar wind action from this current mess that we have here. Now, this is just a weak corona. This is not actually, when you look at the SDO live, totally different here. So we do see an Earth-facing coronal hole that is turning away from Earth now. That could bring us some minor increases in our solar winds, KP indices, maybe around 2 or 3. But what I find interesting is that we did, in fact, get what NOAA called the possibility of a G1. And as you see here, we had, it looks like our solar wind probably tapped out around 400 kilometers per second, kilometers per second. The temp also rose as well. So we had a flurry of activity on the increase, but now since has begun to go away. And my point I'm trying to make is that I wish I would have said something when I announced to you guys that NOAA was calling for a 60% chance for a G1 storm, because I'm not sure why they would think that a coronal hole in the northern part of our star would affect Earth's magnetic field the way they anticipated. And I'll show you the coronal hole that I was talking about, and it's this one right here. NOAA was suggesting that this part of the coronal hole here in the northern part of our star was going to brush up against our magnetic field so much that it would cause a GA1 storm. And not only that we didn't get that storm, but the effects from that were about 2 or 3 days late. So curious to find out why that happened, and would like to dive into that a little bit. Maybe I can look into it, but really it's a non-issue. And I guess that's what I wish I would have just said in the first place back when I noticed that NOAA was calling for a GA1 storm on the 18th or the 19th because of this coronal hole that is in the northern part of our star, which usually those don't affect us too much. Let's take a look at our TSI. We had readings for October 11th at 1360.7642, and that was for October 11th, 2018. And I did want to go over one headline. This was from yesterday. Intense thunderstorms produced strong winds and dropped heavy rain over the desert nation of Qatar on October 19th and 20th, causing severe flash flooding across the country. Heavy rain is expected to continue into Monday, October 22nd. Motorists are advised to exercise extra caution on the roads, residents to avoid all marine activities. They are talking about a year's worth of rain. Now, before we go and make a big deal about a year's worth of rain in a couple hours, let's show you exactly what that actually entails. And for the most part, for instance, Doha receives 0.04 inches during the entire month of October, giving that area 2.9 inches of rain for the entire year. Moderate to heavy rainfall was recorded with a maximum of 3.3 inches in Abu Hamur, which is considered the highest amount ever recorded in Doha area during the month of October. So I just showed you in that area where they get 0.04 inches of rain in the month of October, and the entire year they get on an average of 2.95. Well, they shattered that record in one storm. Now, I know 3.3 inches, not that big of a rainfall, but when you're talking about an area that doesn't see that much rain in the first place, and these cars are submerged, let's take a look at some of this footage if we can. Heavy rain coming down as these cars continue to be submerged into this unprecedented rain that we haven't seen in this area before. So again, I'm sure we'll get more updates about this particular situation. It does not appear that we had any deaths from this or any injuries at this point. This still is a developing story, as rain is expected through tomorrow, October 22nd. But we'll hope for the best here on this one. But I just wanted to point that out. Quite a bit of rain for an area, and before you get concerned when you see the headlines talking about, they got a year's worth of rain in 2 days. Well, I'm here to tell you that they only get right around 3 inches of rain in the entire year. All right, taking a look. Here's some articles that I found today. And since we're kind of lacking some headline stories, we talked about crop loss earlier this week. Still waiting for more information to come out about what the amount is going to be for Michael and Florence. We're still assessing both storms. But here is a interesting article that was published on Tuesday, and it says, some say new little ice age has already started. And I wanted to go over this because there's a lot of talk in the community about grand solar minimum, when we're actually in the grand solar minimum, and is it solar cycle 25, is it cycle 26? And I've started to kind of make mumbles about seeing the grand minimum really kicking in full swing, possibly by 2041. Now, I know you've heard me say, well, maybe we're not in a grand solar minimum now. 2030, those when I believe in cycle 26. What if I told you there's more information coming out and that 25 and 26 are going to be short and weak cycles? So we're still going to continue to see the effects of these grand minimums. We're going to see conditions deteriorate. We're going to still see these rain bombs, these these rain events where a town will get its monthly rainfall in an hour. Those things will continue to happen. Crop loss will continue to happen and will continue to cool. Well, that's what this paper or this article is kind of suggesting here. And it reads, Dr. Francis Koster's column, The Politics of Pure Air, in September 26 post included a statement: natural gas is between 150 and 180 times more powerful than carbon dioxide over its 12.5-year lifetime. This person says, I had trouble with that statement. Methane is about 20 times more efficient than absorbing infrared radiation heat than carbon dioxide. The EPA says that methane's global warming effect is 28 to 36 times that of carbon dioxide over the course of a century. The EPA reports concentrations of methane in the atmosphere has nearly doubled in the last 50 to 60 years, approaching 2 parts per billion compared to carbon dioxide concentration, which is at 400 parts per million. Actually, it's around 411. The half-life of methane is about 8.5 years. That is, half the methane will be converted into carbon dioxide in 8.5 years. Thus, about 35 to 40% of methane here today will remain in 12.4 years. I agree with Dr. Koster that leaking natural gas pipelines contribute to methane in the atmosphere. However, it has been estimated the majority of the increase is due to restoration of the wetlands and generation of marsh gases. Also the Pulkovo Observatory, the Russian Academy of Sciences, St. Petersburg, Russian, has made a prediction that a quasi-centennial epoch of the new little ice age has started at the end of 2015, the maximum phase of solar cycle 24. The start of a solar grand minimum is anticipated in solar cycle 27 plus 1 in 2043 plus 11, and the beginning phase of deep cooling in the new little ice age in 2060 plus 11. This is according to Danish, Australian, German, Irish, British, Japanese, and even American climate scientists believe the Earth is in for a cold spell, and there's disagreement on the length of the cold period. Now, I read this because it's recent. It came out October 2nd of this year. And I find it interesting, the person that points this info out mentions the fact of solar cycle 27. And I've had conversations with people in the GSM community, and they've kind of broke it down to me, like I said earlier. Solar cycle 25 will be short and sweet, but weak. Same with 26, another shorter cycle and even weaker cycle before 2041, 2043, solar cycle 27, which is where we start the grand solar minimum into a deep cooling into the new little ice age by 2060. Now, the reason why this makes sense is because, and this is just basic information, but reading in Upheaval, John Casey talks about that the Earth's temperature takes quite some time to cool to that point of a little ice age. And what we're talking about is decadal cooling. In other words, multiple decades of cooler temperatures, lower solar activity. If you stack them up next to each other, you're going to have a foundation of cooler temps versus of a cycle that's cold, then warm, then cold, then warm. You're not going to do anything. But in this situation, this does open the door for solar cycle 24, which we know the max ended in 15. We started seeing things go on the decline side in 16. But now we're talking about the rest of this decade being cooler. We're definitely looking at solar cycle 25 next decade from 2020 and beyond is definitely another decade of cooling. So there's back-to-back cooling decades. And if they're predicting for 2030 another short cycle that has low solar activity, almost record low solar activity, and now you've got 3 decades back to back to back. So when you hear people talking about deep cooling by 2060 or 2043 when the grand solar minimum is anticipated to start by some scientists, not everybody agrees with this, but if indeed we do see the grand minimum start at solar cycle 27, then we're talking about way cooler temperatures than what we're talking about right now. The thought that if we were heading into the grand solar minimum by 2030, that's only back-to-back decades of cooling temperatures, lower solar activity. But we're supposed to see a repeat of solar cycle 24 and weaker. And then 25, 26, 27 are going to be weaker than the ones before it. So that puts us right about 3 to 4 decades in a row and cycles in a row that are showing cooling. And like I said, it's a foundation thing. So by 2050, 2060, you hear people saying, oh, we're going to be in an ice age, maybe a little ice age. And I think some of these theories are starting to come together as the closer we get to this event, the more the information is starting to make a little more sense. Now, I could be wrong, and we go right straight into the grand solar minimum in cycle 25. Because there's evidence out there that people think that's going to happen in 2019, 2020. That's where we're going to see the real grand solar minimum, or even 2031. But we have to be patient with the new studies that come out, because that's what we're asking the global warming folks to be, is patient. Hey, look, don't discount the last 15 years of research just because the other 60 say something different. And that's actually kind of another thing. I found another article today that talks about people in the 60s and 70s talking about climate change being a thing of natural cycles. And, here's the article, and I'll read most of this to you guys, actually. But no, just wanted to point this out. Letter to the editor, nothing serious. This is not from a scientist of any sorts. This is just an opinion based on this person's individual research, looking at papers that he's looking at predictions of solar cycles. And folks, look, all I'm saying is if this thing is being pushed out to 2040, I mean, we're probably going to see a deeper minimum than the moderate minimum, in my opinion, because now we're stacking up solar cycles that are showing cooling, and the more cooling we get per cycle, the lower the overall temperatures are going to be here on Earth. Let's take a look at this article. After warmest year on record, brace for years without summer. Now, this article was written in March of 2016. Looks like it's a blog of some sort. I'm not sure who the nation is, the Thailand portal. I have ideas on who might be helping, but there is a lot of good information in this article. In January of this year, talking about 2015, the U.S. NOAA administration and NASA's Goddard Institute declared 2015 the warmest year on record. Probably the only time that NOAA and NASA agreed firmly together on something. This is probably the last time they agreed firmly. Skeptical scientists were quick to slam this assessment as being chalked up with the adjusted and modeled data, according to Tony Heller, who we love here, who runs a leading climate change skeptic blog. 45% of the data used to construct the warmest year on record was in some way tampered with. He points out that to come to this conclusion, the U.S. agencies modeled data for massive swaths of territory, like the entire Russian territory of Siberia, because they do not have access to those areas. Data from those places conveniently uses highest possible values. Dr. Roy Spencer, who runs one of 2 U.S. satellites that measure temperature, both with which show no warming and even a cooling trend when adjusted, has charged that the NOAA removes or adjusts the more reliable rural surface data, instead uses unreliable urban data showing warmer temperatures due to the effect of human activity. Makes sense. Now we know what we're talking about with the RSSTs. Even as NASA's Goddard Institute proclaims that the Earth is overheating, its own research on Antarctica challenges the conclusions of other studies, including the Intergovernmental Panel Climate Change IPCC 2013 report, which says that Antarctica is overall losing land ice. Well, we all know that's not true here in 2018. In fact, we recorded, I think it was a negative 98 degrees below Fahrenheit below 0 Fahrenheit. So that's pretty freaking cold. Antarctica is not losing ice. But according to this new analysis in 2015 of satellite data, the Antarctic sheet showed a net gain of 112 billion tons a year from 1992 to 2001. That showed a net gain of 82 billion tons of ice per year between 2003 and 2008. Our sun does not maintain a constant intensity. Instead, it cycles between solar maximums and solar minimums. The Middle Ages were dominated by a series of solar minimums, each named after the researchers that discovered them, from the Wolf minimum to Maunder minimum, the Dalton minimum. Fluctuating solar activity over 400 years brought less solar irradiation to Earth, creating a cooler effect. In addition to the lesser irradiation, solar minimums also tend to increase volcanic activity, which in turn cools the Earth even more by blocking sunlight from reaching Earth's surface. We've talked about this before. Once we see eruptions into the 50,000 feet of the stratosphere, now we're talking about blocking sunlight and creating a cooling mechanism here. But that's not all. Solar minimums allow cosmic rays to penetrate the Earth's atmosphere, which in turn seed low-level clouds, which I'll say this right now, it is amazing on how much noticeable these low-level clouds really are nowadays. Very thick, very dark, and very low. You almost look like you can reach up and touch them. It says here, cooling even more with these low-level clouds. Known as the mini ice age, this period saw intense winters in the northern hemisphere and snow in the tropics. MIA was not consistent. Some periods were devastatingly cold, while others were not so bad. The year 1816, we all know about Tambora with the year without summer, right in the middle of the Dalton minimum. It talks about there have been similar weather phenomena during the 1600s, during the modern minimum, when they were talking about disease and famine. And then here we refer to the 1960s and 70s scientists pioneer climate science based on natural cycles. One of these scientists was a brilliant woman named Leona Woods Libby. Libby was the youngest and only female scientist to work on the nuclear reactor during the Manhattan Project, which developed the atomic bomb. After World War II, she helped pioneer climate science based on natural cycles. Using tree ring data and ice cores, Dr. Libby and other scientists such as George Kaluka determined that the overall climate was determined by reoccurring natural cycles dominated by the sun. Using the past cycles they forecasted in the future, they predicted in the 1970s, which had been the fourth decade of a cooling trend going back to the 30s, that there would be global warming for 2 decades until 2000, followed by a 50-year cooling trend. Sounds very familiar. Theodore Landshut was another scientist of the era, theorized in addition to solar activity, the Earth's climates can be dominated by the solar system's giant planets, Jupiter, Saturn, and Uranus. Also, Neptune was in that original as well. When it talks about configurations of solar minimum can bend the Earth's magnetic poles to create a perfect storm like the one that occurred in 1816. Since 1988, establishment climate scientists have been dominated by the theory of man-made global warming. Basically, climate science based on natural cycles have been shelved. Why? Well, we know why. There's money involved. Billions of dollars yearly for the global warming research. NOAA, all of them. How much money would they lose? If President Trump cut off all grant money to everyone who says that CO2 contributes to warming, what would happen to the IPCC? What would happen to NOAA? What would happen to some of these big-time universities? Would they increase their tuitions because now the government's not paying them all that fat cash they're used to? It's really ridiculous what you could get for a grant out there. I've had people tell me, get $1 million or $2 million to study some stuff about cosmic rays. Let's do it. I'm all for that. But, you got to make sure when you're taking that kind of cheese from the government, you better have results. This is something that you would want to put real time into and get real results and use real things that will help you get the answers, not just, sitting around and checking out links. So I think there's a lot of fear in the community as well for global warmists that once this does get completely disclosed, what we're going into, are some of these organizations going to be asked to pay this money back? Are some of these people going to say, you gave us bad science? We gave you billions of dollars based on bad science that you knew was bad and continued to go along with that bad science, convincing your government and swindling tax dollars from people who work hard for that money and line the pockets of people like Al Gore and others who benefit from this gibberish of CO2 causing warming. This article continues about the cold temperatures that we had in New York's Whiteface Mountains back in 2015, the insanely cold of minus 78.8 degrees Celsius, folks. Whiteface. This person also continues the article, drops a couple of names, talks about David Dubine. Also wants to mention that with the establishment sticking with anthropogenic global warming, independent researchers like John Casey, a former White House and Congress science advisor, are dusting off the old natural climate cycle science, basically, to predict an era of sustained colds, insisting that, like Dr. Libby was saying, was right all along. Very important, because what were we calling these folks back in the 70s? Were we calling them pseudoscience? We accepted it. We accepted that the sun drives the climate. What happened? I think our own ignorance took over in the 80s and 90s. We haven't seen this before. This has got to be warming. Now, some scientists in the 70s and 60s and 70s predicted warming for a period of 20 years. And it happened. It did. It really happened. From 98 until about 2016. About 20 years. So, if these scientists were right back in the 70s, and they're right now, and they're predicting at least 30 years of cooling, what they're talking about is natural cycles and this upcoming grand solar minimum. And as these minimums continue to pile up, we'll see increased cosmic rays. Look, 18% is what we are now as far as above normal on cosmic radiation. 18% in most parts of the United States. If it's 18% and we're just at the tail end of 24, we haven't even begun 25. I'm frightened to hear the numbers for solar cycle 25. If we're so lucky that we have this technology in 10 years from now, I bet you the numbers are going to be staggering. But again, it's one of those things that time will tell. Time will tell. And the last article I wanted to bring up was important because recently I was in a little bit of a debate with NOAA on Facebook. And then I find this article as of Monday, October 1st. Now, mind you, this article was maybe 7 days old when I had my discussion with NOAA on Facebook. But I think this is huge for an article to come out with an organization like NASA, which a lot of folks, like I said, hand in hand there for a while. In 2015, NASA and NOAA agreed that it was the warmest year on record. But here's the difference between NOAA and NASA. NASA had done a study earlier this year, or the results came out, that CO2 is a greening effect and not a warming effect. Sometime in February of 2018, Donald Trump signed the end for funding NASA's research on the correlation between CO2 and warming. And now, fast forward that 8 months later, and now NASA is coming out and saying, we see a climate cooling trend thanks to low sun activity. Now, when I found this article, there were several articles on the internet that basically said that the grand solar minimum wouldn't put a dent into this cooling. There's no way. These hardcore, people who believe in global warming is man-made, blah, blah, blah. NASA says so too. Well, what do they got to say to this? I'll read this. The climate alarmists just can't catch a break. NASA is reporting that the sun is entering one of the deepest solar minima of the space age, and Earth's atmosphere is not responding the way they thought it would. So start pumping out that CO2, everyone. We're going to need all the greenhouse gases we can get. Says here, Martin Malinzek of the Langley Research Center of NASA, we see a cooling trend. High above Earth's surface, near the edge of space, our atmosphere is losing heat energy. If current trends continue, it could set a space age record for cold. Now, we reported this a couple weeks ago as well from SPACEWEATHER.com, talking about the thermosphere shrinking. And not only are we seeing colder temperatures in the upper atmosphere, but now we're starting to see that effect as well. The trend may be warming for the lower atmosphere, but right now we are definitely on the decline. The new data is coming from NASA's sounding of the atmosphere using broadband emissions radiation, or what they call SABRE instrument, which is on board the space agency's thermosphere, ionosphere, mesosphere, energetics, and dynamics satellite. SABRE monitored infrared radiation from CO2 and nitric oxide, two substances that play a vital role in the energy output of our thermosphere, the very top level of our atmosphere, which ironically we just got done talked about. Says here the thermosphere always cools off during solar minimum. It's one of the most important ways the solar cycle affects our planet. Who knew that the big yellow ball of light in the sky would have such a big influence on our climate? Well, I'll tell you who. The scientists back in the 60s and 70s, when they were telling everyone, and it was accepted. It was taught that way in schools. The sun dominates the climate. Says here there's a bit of good news in all this. When the thermosphere cools, it literally shrinks, therefore reducing aerodynamic drag on satellites in low Earth orbit. In effect, the shrinking thermosphere increases satellites' lifetime. Okay, I guess that's the silver lining. But that appears to be where the good news ends, unless you prefer cold weather and increased space junk. The bad news, according to Dr. Tony Phillips, editor of SpaceWeather.com, it also delays the natural decay of space junk, resulting in a more cluttered environment around Earth. Right now, the TCI is very low indeed. SABRE is currently measuring 33 billion watts of infrared power from NO. That is 10 times smaller than we see during more active phases of the solar cycles. 10 times smaller what they normally see. SABRE has been in orbit for only 17 years, but Malinzek and scientists at NASA's Langley Research Center have been able to recreate TCI measurements back to the 40s. Says SABRE taught us how to do this by revealing how TCI depends on other variables such as geomagnetic activity and the sun's UV output. These things have been measured for decades. In fact, TCI numbers now in closing months of 2008 are very close to setting record lows since measurements began. We're not quite there yet, but it could happen in a matter of months. This was just this month, guys. The NASA findings are in line with studies by the University UC San Diego, Northumbria University in Great Britain, where we have Ms. Sarkova, which both predict a grand solar minimum in coming decades due to low sunspot activity. Both studies predicted sun activity to be similar to the modern minimum, which coincided to be known as the Little Ice Age. If all this seems as if NASA is contradicting itself, you're right, sort of. After all, NASA also reported last week that Arctic sea ice was at its 6th lowest level since measuring began. Isn't that a sure sign of global warming? All any of this proves is that we have, at best, a cursory understanding of Earth's incredibly complex climate system. So when mainstream media and credit clown salesman Al Gore breathlessly warn you that we must do something about climate change, it's all right to step back and take a deep breath and realize that we don't have the knowledge, skill, or resources to have much effect on Earth's climate. God and that big yellow ball of light in the sky have much more impact on our climate than we ever could. And I got to say, that is how you close out the article. Again, this is not new information. This is not new information. These folks are simply writing articles that refer to a time where The natural cycles were welcomed. And then we got into the late 80s, and I guess that's where the real greed kicked in, right? Inflation, everything sat in. We were trying to figure out a way how to pump up this economy. How do we get richer? How do the rich get richer? How does the government make more? Because think about it. Back in the 80s, what were you guys paying for gas? 88? I think 1988, we were probably like, 40, 50 cents a gallon? Maybe a little lower? Hell, even 1996, we were still under $1 for a gallon of gas. So what happened? Carbon taxes. That's what. Yeah, they talked about oil spills and the reserves are low, and we've got 3 years in reserves right now and another 4 years on this reserve, but we were short 100,000 barrels a day, so we're going to jack the price up a whole $1. No, these were jacked up because of the carbon taxes that were starting to take place. And then the money started rolling in. And these people were like, hey, this is it. This is it. This is it. Remember back in the 70s when they predicted warming to happen in 2000? Remember? They predicted it back in the 70s. It's happening. Let's capitalize on this. And I think that's what some of these guys did. I think there's a blueprint out there for AGW folks who raise money for this, who live off of this money. There's a blueprint. Sad part is that we were talking the other day about CO2 and how we are talking about the shrinking thermosphere and how we are heading into cooling periods and just on and on and on and on. My question is, our CO2 levels are still at record levels, 411 parts per million. So why are we not hot right now? Yeah, we had a couple of warm days in October in some spots in the United States, but right now, I think everybody's pretty average temperature-wise. So just some interesting articles I wanted to bring up. I thought I left the links in the description. I think everybody should take a look at these articles. And just remember, the natural cycles were once embraced, and we weren't called climate deniers. We were people who were using our heads. And yeah, some of the data that we were, you can't be totally 100% reliable. We're talking about tree rings and ice cores. So it's precise measurements that are being taken from these samples. But you get the general idea. And I think they're pretty close compared to what they're trying to do now. Speaking of temperatures, we look pretty normal for the most part. We see the most cooler weather out here in the eastern United States, northeast. Believe it or not, even in the northern plains, you guys are sitting pretty right now in the mid-60s, high 50s in some spots. The west coast, San Francisco, sitting at 80 degrees, 75 in Sacramento. Places like Seattle, 65 degrees. Not too shabby for this time of year. So we're right about in line where we should be as far as October temperatures. The cooler areas, obviously, are definitely in the northeast right now, upstate New York and beyond. So, and guys, honestly, right now we are looking at not a lot weather-wise tonight. I just, if anything, I wanted to do a show tonight and talk about these little articles that I'd found and how I'm starting to see more and more information come out about the grand solar minimum and what was being said about in the 70s. We've Tony Heller broke it down really good too. He did a video where he shows all of these headlines from the 70s and how everyone was saying exactly what's happening right now is happening. And somehow we've allowed mainstream media and crooks like Al Gore to twist the words and blame you for this. This is all your fault, according to these clowns. Take a look at some SST right now in the northern Atlantic. We are starting to see it cool down once again below baseline. We have been above baseline 3 times since April, and it is October 21st, and we are dropping once again. The El Nino also dropping. We had a surge in temperatures for a few weeks, and now we appear to be back into the neutral zone of what we call El Nino. Now, you have to have these temperatures in that 5 and up temperature range for a consecutive time of I think it's 3 months. So it'll be interesting to see if we just had a little bit of a peak and this thing goes back to neutral and stays closer to baseline, And then late this winter, will we get conditions for an El Nino? I don't know. But, the other day I remember late September thinking there's no way that we're getting an El Nino. And then, boom, we just went way up. Now, I can tell you this. This still doesn't, to me, line up with what we're seeing on El Nino graph. But we are noticing cooler waters in the Pacific as well. So time will tell. Looking at our forecast, this is a snowfall by the end of the month, October 31st on Halloween. So everybody looks like you're going to have a pretty normal Halloween trick-or-treat night, except for some of us here in the Northeast, upstate New York, parts of Maine. We might see some small accumulations, and I do mean small accumulations. Nothing real heavy right now as far as snowpack goes. BC and Alberta, you guys continue to see that snow pile up. And right above us here in Ontario, we're starting to get a little bit more frequency in snowfall and cold air as well. And this has been acting up on me all day today. And I'm finally starting to see a little bit futurecast here. A lot of moisture in the south. Northeast gets a couple tastes of maybe a possibility of a wintry mix from this disturbance that we're going to see that kind of gets started in the Gulf and just rakes the coast of the Gulf and then just stays all the way up through the East Coast. And the back end of this, the air is going to be cold enough for snow in the Northeast, especially upstate New York, parts of western Pennsylvania. This is next Sunday, so we're a week out. Familiar pattern, though, building up, folks. If you look out to the northwest, you'll see snow and rain in the northwest part of our country, and then that slope where that warm front goes all the way down to Indiana and then drops into Georgia and South Carolina. That cooler air will funnel down in here, and that's what's going to help give us some snow before this system moves all the way through. And this might actually bring this area's first accumulated snow. The radar models right now are predicting a mix between rain and snow to go in and out. So I'm assuming nighttime and daytime temperatures will allow it to snow, and that's going to be the only difference. So as we get out of October, November looks to get a little bit more busier, and also we are starting to see a lot more snow and a lot more cooler temperatures arriving as well. Now, I've had problems with the GFS. This, as far as I can get it to go, is on Halloween, but I did see an earlier forecast that took us all the way out to November 3rd, and we are to expect more of the same. Temperatures generally like fall, but I want to take a look at Wyoming and Colorado. We are looking at possibly a major snowstorm in that area right on Halloween for trick-or-treat night. So just some stuff to keep our eyes on. The good news, the best part about this, and before I speak too soon, let's take a quick look. But the best news about this so far is it does appear that the Gulf side and the Atlantic side, and I looked at the STs earlier today, but we are now seeing a trend in our waters in the Atlantic as they begin to cool. So we might be done with the hurricane. That little disturbance that's going to rake the East Coast, almost like a nor'easter, except that high pressure is still camping out in the middle of the Atlantic. So the thoughts of possibly seeing a polar vortex here soon, I don't see it now. The conditions don't represent the possibility of any kind of polar vortex. We're just going to see normal fall-like temperatures. Mari, how's everybody doing tonight in the chat?
Everyone's doing awesome in the chat tonight, Jake. Thank you. Do you hear that dog rattling? He always does that, doesn't he? I just want to thank Justin L. He did a super chat. Thank you very much. We're talking about the volcano on Mars. People are talking about that. Yeah. We don't. I don't have the information in front of me, but I know Rob sent you something. I know Mars and several other planets have volcanoes, so a lot of people don't realize that. They just think Earth is like the one and only planet with volcanoes, but that actually is not the case. So maybe we can report on that next show with a little bit more detail. I don't know, Jake.
Yeah.
What do you think?
No, Rob actually did contact me before the show and mentioned that there was a big eruption on Mars. So interesting. And it's kind of like we went on a friend of ours' channel last night, Milky Way, and I brought up a fact that we are seeing a solar system being affected by the sun right now. Not just planet Earth. This is not just because the cycle we're monitoring here from Earth doesn't mean other planets in our solar system aren't affected by this. And the best part about where we live now in society and technology is that we actually have the tools to monitor this. So we're going to see what this minimum does the entire solar system, not just here. So again, that doesn't surprise me to hear things like, Mars having a major volcano eruption. But yes, Rob, I appreciate the heads up on that. I was actually going to mention that at the end, but just kind of rambling on about some of this natural cycle stuff that we were taught in the 60s and 70s is starting to surface again. And why shouldn't it? If it was good enough for us back then, which I think, I'm sure a lot of you will agree, but if you grew up in the 60s and 70s, you probably grew up in some times that were a lot better than what we're looking at right now as far as morals and politics go and everything else in between. With that being said, guys, we really appreciate you tuning. We appreciate your support, your continued support. Please continue to like and share our videos. If you are subscribed, make sure you check and make sure that bell has been clicked on. I know a lot of folks complain about not getting notifications when it comes to our shows. So, guys, take care. We hope you have a great end of your weekend, and we shall be back Monday, 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Till then, we will talk soon.